Let's expand the view this morning and take a look at the overall big picture over the next 7 days and break down the details for you. First, we've got this dominating ridge of high pressure that's been locked over the desert southwest, now getting back into those areas across the central plains. But where you see the weakness of the ridge is just on the northern perimeter of that. In northern Colorado, they saw some big hail yesterday. Now that's sneaking up into Nebraska and going all the way up into the Dakotas, where they're going to be seeing rounds of severe storms over the coming days. But there's also another little feature that's kind of concerning off the Carolina coast. We're going to have to watch this because the National Hurricane Center has upgraded this to a 40% probability, and a lot of indications it could spread some very heavy rain, and flooding is a huge concern in the Carolinas, while much of the Pacific continues to remain on the very active side. So let's take a look at the overall severe threat for this afternoon. There is that blob of moisture this morning. It's going to be expanding deeper into the Dakotas and blowing up into the heat of the afternoon. That's why we do have that slight risk for severe storms. We do have an elevated tornado threat up there in Bismarck, down to Rapid City, as well as into Sioux Falls. That's going to be a concern with those supercells. They're going to be racing across just outside of that ridge and sneaking over into areas of Minnesota later on this evening. But in the tropics, there is Dexter. That's our fourth named storm. It's not going to be impacting any landmass, but it is the fourth named storm and actually we're actually above average. You don't really get the fourth named storm until August 15th, even though it may not feel that way. We are slightly above average for this storm season. But there's also two areas that are highlighted by the National Hurricane Center. First, this formidable wave that came off the coast. That's an indication that will likely form into a possible another tropical storm that could be Aaron, and that doesn't look to actually impact land. But more concerning, what's closer to land, this little tropical low now upgraded to a 40% probability of it forming in the coming days. And there's definitely a lot of indications where it could skirt the coast, but inland flooding is definitely going to be a huge concern, especially there in the Carolinas. So we got to be high alert, because a lot of the short range guidance has a lot of excessive rain over the next 3 to 5 days with this particular system. So the European guidance is a little bit more bullish. Right now, we've got about 70 to 80% probability this forms at least into a depression sometime on Friday or into Saturday. So we'll have to watch this as this gets deeper into the week, and we'll be fine tuning that kind of every step of the way. So, but if you break down the ensembles of what's to come, there's that wave that's coming off the African coast. Yes, most indications this has it forming into a storm, if not a hurricane, but also most indications have this going well out to sea. There is the other storm that we talked about for the Carolinas, but there's also another wave that's going to be coming off the African coast sometime tomorrow. We'll have to watch that deeper into the 7 to 10 day period, because a lot of indications on that one, it looks to be fairly bullish and maybe one to watch that might try to sneak into the Caribbean. The overall GFS is kind of hinting at the same thing with those two or three different waves. So we'll definitely be looking at the tropics in the days to come. But what's going to be happening closer inland is that just that dominating ridge of high pressure is going to be expanding, and it only gets hotter. Of course, that's what you expect this time of year. So that little cool down we had for some of you, that was definitely nice, but it comes back with a vengeance with the ridge of high pressure coming back. And it's still going to be over the desert southwest, but it extends back into Texas, Oklahoma, and back into Kansas again, and eliminates that kind of northwest flow that y'all kind of get spoiled over the last coming days that brought the cooler air and some of those storms that traversed across that track. But where you see the weakness is just on the northern periphery. That's why we do have severe storms today across the Dakotas, not just today, but going into tomorrow. Right now, we do have a marginal risk for severe storms, likely going to be in the same areas across Nebraska, through the Dakotas, back into portions of Iowa again, as well as in areas of Minnesota, getting into Minneapolis. and just kind of a repeat performance again on Thursday as more storms will be riding the northern periphery of that ridge, and storms got to go somewhere. If all that ridge takes up multiple stakes with a lot of sinking air and just bone dry conditions, that moisture's got to go up and over the ridge, and that's exactly what's going to unfold between now and Thursday. But what's definitely concerning is some of the high resolution guidances of what's to come is where the areas that are going to rain. And there's definitely some areas, but outside of that, where you see the blank areas, that is your dry, that's where you see the, that's where the heat dome is, right? That's where all the sinking air is taking place. And where you see where the rain is, that's where the weakness comes into play through the Dakotas. And as these things get going, they're going to be turning southeast movers. Those are typically bigger hail producers and can potentially produce some tornadoes along the way. But turn your attention to the southeast, because that's where our little tropical low is. The longer it just kind of sits and spins out here in the open waters, it's going to spread tropical moisture in the backside. And typically inland flooding is definitely a huge concern with these weak tropical systems. And yes, if you kind of zoom into some of these totals on the latest high resolution guidances just over the next 2 days, it's definitely spitting out some crazy, insane amounts, 4, 5, 6, 8 inches, but definitely isolated pockets could be seeing some double-digit rainfall totals. So that is definitely concerning for those areas into the Carolinas, especially with all those hills that you have out there. Flooding is definitely going to be a huge concern, and that's just through tomorrow. Right? That's over the next 48 hours. The low is still going to be offshore and still kind of getting its act together. So this could be a prolonged system that could be raining an excessive amount and adding up to some serious totals by the time this week is done. So if we kind of zoom into the latest European guidance, it basically spits out a lower end low pressure center. That's why the National Hurricane Center has a 40% probability of this forming. So if anything, it might form a weak tropical depression, a weak tropical storm, but that's not going to be the main story. The main story is the abundance amount of rain it's going to leave behind for those areas into South Carolina, North Carolina, getting in Virginia, and eventually actually even sneaking into Florida. The latest ICON guidance, again, has it weak, 1,013 millibars. That could be just a very weak tropical depression, very weak tropical storm. So that's we'll just have to watch the progression throughout the week. But what's going to be alive and well is the heat that will likely come back with a vengeance. So all those areas in the middle part of the country that were loving the 70 high temperatures, that's going to be a distant memory as August comes back with the triple digits and 90s widespread, lifting all the way back into the Kansas region, getting back into Nebraska, into the Dakotas, into Minnesota, Iowa by the time we get into Friday. So the definitely heat really starts to build all throughout the week as that high just kind of takes over and just expands in the coming days. Where you see the cooler areas, that's where the weakness of the ridge, and that's where you have that tropical low at. And obviously where it's raining and where it's cloudy, it's going to be cooler, especially in the summer months. But if we look at this over the next 7 to 10 days with that low, here's the concerning part. First, we've got the weakness. That's where some of the rain is going to fall with those storm tracks of northern periphery of the ridge. But turn your attention to the Carolinas, and this is an anomaly track. When we're seeing anomalies like this of 300, 400, 500% above what you typically see this time of year, that is deeply concerning. That is an indication where we could be looking at some extreme amount of rainfall over the coming days. So we'll have to really taking an eye on what the track of this storm, because the longer it just kind of sits there off the coast, the more it's able to kind of spin up and the more it's going to spit rain bands inland. And it's a long progression event. So this is only Tuesday. We could be looking at still talking about this little storm off the Carolina coast even till by Sunday. That's how much rain we're potentially talking about, and that's why we're seeing indications of 400 to 500% above average. So that is definitely concerning going forward. And if you break it down as far as the temperature map, obviously it's August, it's going to be hot, right? So there are a little bit of areas where you see a little bit of cooler weather, you know, that you a little bit, you know, less hot, I guess you could say, than what you would typically see this time of year. And of course, where it's going to rain predominantly along the Carolinas into Georgia, it's going to be below average. But outside of that, it's going to feel like August in a big way. The heat is going to come back and it's going to take over for much of the country in the week ahead. So guys, I appreciate you watching. Do like this video, definitely hit the subscribe button, and catch the next update while I protect you before and after the storm.